This is U.S. History Regents Review, Unit 3, video number 1. For this unit, we are going to be going over Reconstruction, westward expansion, and industrialization and immigration. Notice that each of these units takes place primarily in one region of the United States, but they're all deeply interconnected. So while Reconstruction is going on in the South, westward expansion is happening out west, but also industrialization and immigration are happening in northeastern cities. But all of these things are connected, they're related, they're happening simultaneously. So we're first going to talk about Reconstruction. What is Reconstruction? It is the time period after the Civil War where the country is trying to rebuild itself, both to come together as one unified country again after a really bitter war where Americans were killing other Americans, and also about physically rebuilding the South, which had been destroyed during the Civil War. So remember that Lincoln was assassinated at the end of the Civil War, and his vice president, Andrew Johnson, who was more of a Southerner, became the president. And there were some serious disagreements about exactly what Reconstruction should look like. So Lincoln originally wanted to move forward by healing the country, having just 10% of Southerners take a loyalty oath to come back in. He had all these ideas about fixing things. We don't totally know what he would have done since he died, but Johnson ends up more or less following along with some of the same guidelines, while also being just completely not caring at all about the well-being of freedmen. So on the one side here, this is Andrew Johnson. He quickly pardoned most former Confederate soldiers for their rebellion. We don't see most of them being executed or anything. There are early constitutional conventions for Southern states to bring them back into the Union quickly. And he felt that ending slavery was more important than securing full equal rights for African Americans. And that's putting it pretty lightly. He was actually probably our most openly racist president. He did not really think that African Americans needed to be a part of this new country and should stay separate from white Americans. And he actively did not want the federal government to spend money helping these new freemen. Meanwhile, the radical Republicans, this was a group in Congress of Republicans, and radical means extreme, who wanted to punish the South. That was their main goal. And they wanted equal rights for African Americans, and they wanted to punish Confederate soldiers through a harsh loyalty test. And remember, radical Republicans, they are all part of Congress, the legislative branch, while Johnson is in the executive branch. So let's first talk about the Reconstruction Plan. What actually happened? The South was split into 5 military districts. You can see it on this map right here, that the federal government was overseeing. So the military was down south trying to implement these new governments, trying to bring the states back into the Union. And the Southern states were all required to sign the 14th Amendment. There are 3 big amendments during this time period. The first, which was passed at the end of the Civil War, was the 13th Amendment. This abolished slavery in the United States forever. This is huge. Then the 14th Amendment stated that all people born in the United States are citizens and have equal protection under the law. This means that freedmen are citizens. All Southern states re-entering the Union were required to pass this amendment. And then a few years later, the 15th Amendment is passed, which says that you cannot take away the right to vote based on race. This is huge. However, when it was passed, it was controversial. Who was it controversial for? Women. Women's groups who had supported the abolition movement, many of them were very upset that this did not include gender. African Americans like Frederick Douglass said that, it's the Negro hour, as he said, that it was time for Black men to get this right to vote and that women would get their turn later. I mean, little did they really realize that that would mean like 70 years later. So all men now have suffrage, meaning the right to vote. So 13th, 14th, 15th, memorize these. A good acronym or mnemonic is Free Citizens Vote. Free Citizens Vote, 13, 14, 15. Under the Reconstruction Plan, most Confederates were pardoned, and a Freedmen's Bureau was created, meant to help slaves transition to being free. And actually, a lot of Northerners came south, like a lot of like some white women who wanted to help, came south and they set up schools. They were trying to give some people training so they could have jobs. So this was the original idea about Reconstruction. Here's the federal government defending these newly freed African Americans. But there are some serious tensions that continue. There is deep bitterness throughout the federal government and throughout each southern state. Johnson was openly racist, and here's some of our evidence. He vetoed an extension of the Freedmen's Bureau. He didn't want to spend money on it. And he vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. He had no interest in helping the freedmen. And actually, Congress overrides a bunch of his vetoes. Here's a cartoon of Johnson just kicking down the freedmen, and he's using the veto to do that. And this big conflict between the branches of government gets to its most extreme point when the radical Republicans voted to impeach President Johnson. They kind of set up a trap for him so he would break a law, but he was not kicked out of office. Because remember, impeaching just means being formally accused of a crime. But by one vote, he did not get kicked out of the office. So this is an example of a conflict between executive and legislative branches. They disagree. Johnson vetoes legislation while Congress overrides it. Southern states are really bitter about this federal occupation, and they will resist by voting the same way. It gets the nickname the Solid South, because for the next century, most Southern states all vote for Democrats. They all vote together. So, like, if you look at some election maps, you'll see like Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Arkansas, like they all vote for the same people. And that's still to some extent true today. There's some other derogatory nicknames people gave because they were angry about the situation. Scalawags was a term for white Southern Republicans. So people they thought were traitors to the Confederacy and decided to join the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln. And carpetbaggers, named after literally carpetbag. Like here's this cartoon. It's a term for Northerners who moved to the South for Reconstruction. And while some of them did that to like I said earlier, like set up schools, there were also people who took advantage of the fact that the South was destroyed so they could invest in it and make money. Or they came and ran for office in the South because they thought they could win an office, even though they weren't from the South. So people are taking advantage of the situation. They're packing up their bags, their suitcases, their carpet bags, and going south. African Americans, however, lose their rights. So while there's an initial plan to try to help them, there was one plan that would have given them 40 acres and a mule. All these things fall apart during Reconstruction. So while the federal government does have some power to try to enforce the rights at first, it's like the 15th Amendment, after it's passed, freedmen actually go out and they vote. Here's a pretty famous cartoon of that. And they join the Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, and some are even elected to Congress. A man named Hiram Revels actually became the first black senator. But this is really short-lived because eventually Reconstruction ends. And it ends with the Compromise of 1877. This is when the federal government withdrew from the South. They left and let the southern states do their own thing. And this agreement came because there was a big dispute over an election, and they end up deciding that the Republican, Rutherford B. Hayes, could become president, but meanwhile, the federal government had to leave the South. So that was the compromise. And the second the federal government leaves and stops looking over things, all these horrible things happen. So black codes were created to limit the freedoms of freedmen. Sharecropping was a system that kept blacks perpetually in debt.